Welcome back to the 2009 No Fluff Just Stuff tour. We're here today with Neal Ford. Neal just finished up a presentation here a little bit ago on emergent architecture and design. It's one of our more popular talks on tour because I think he really kind of distills and gives some clear information in that space that people need to know about. So Neal, welcome, and why don't you share a few nuggets of knowledge, if you will.
Okay, well, the original title for this talk was going to be Emergent Design and Architecture. And one of my colleagues convinced me that emergent design is a good idea, but emergent architecture is a big mistake. Because the architecture is the foundation for the other stuff that you end up building. So one of the things I do in this talk is define what I mean when I'm talking about software architecture and software design. And architecture is one of those things you have to have something in place before you can do anything else. And so you have to have some sort of bedrock of architecture there. But it can evolve over time. One of the definitions I give that is my favorite definition of architecture is stuff that's hard to change later. And there should be as little of that stuff as possible.
Oh, but why? But why?
It's the bedrock, you know. And it's, you can build things on top of that, but it's really hard to change later. So the language you pick is part of the architecture. The database server you use is part of the architecture because it's really hard to change those things later. But sitting on top of that, almost like the foundation, rests design. And design is much lighter. In fact, design, you can start out with just kind of a vague idea, and as long as you don't let your preconceptions poison you, you can kind of let the design emerge over time. And one of the things, the terms that I define in this talk, is this idea of an idiomatic pattern in an application. Because everybody's familiar with design patterns. These are these big formal definitions of problems that appear in every piece of software. And that's a good thing, but every application also has idiomatic patterns, which are the patterns that show up in repeated places within this application for this problem domain, but they're not formal enough to write a book about, but you still need to be able to identify and harvest those things, because when you can find one of those things where the marketing department and the sales department are doing almost the same thing, they just don't realize it, then you can create a nice, elegant design that uses the common elements together, and then just, you know, the few minor differences between that business process. And so part of the job of the designer is identifying those idiomatic patterns in the design of the software. So design is much more malleable. It's much easier to change it once you get in the process. And in fact, you pretty much have to do that, because we've pretty well shown in software now, I think, that big design up front just doesn't work. And I go into a lot of the details of why that is, the manufacturing metaphor and all that stuff, and also some definitions of software design that are kind of surprising, in that one that's based on a Jack Reeves essay from 1992, that the design specification for software is really the entire set of source code. It's not UML diagrams and sequence diagrams and whiteboard scribblings. Those all get you to the point where you can create the real design, which is the software, but the complete source code is ultimately the design of the software. And so if you're talking about design, it has to include code, because that ultimately is the expression of that design. And that can emerge over time. I'll give some examples. Tests allow you to refine your design and learn more about it over time. Because one of the problems in software, you start to build something, and that's the time that you know the least about the problem. And the longer you spend in the problem space, the more you understand it, the more you can identify idiomatic patterns and formal design patterns. And so if you let that emerge over time, you don't start with nothing, but you start with as little as you can, and let that emerge over time, you'll end up with a much more robust, much more sustainable design. The lean software, the lean manufacturing guys have this great phrase that I talk about in my talk: the last responsible moment for a decision. And that's a really great concept. Instead of speculatively saying, oh, I'm sure we're going to need that, so let's go ahead and pile that on now, that just adds complexity early.
Right.
Always think, what is the last responsible moment I can make this design decision, or even this architectural decision, so that I give myself the most number of options for the longest amount of time. And then when I finally do make that decision, what can I do to make that decision reversible? So I think one of my goals in this talk is to really provide a nomenclature for people to really start talking about architecture and design. Because I've been to a lot of the architecture birds of a feather here at NoFluff, and almost every one of them starts with the what does architecture mean in software. And once we get a common set of vocabulary for that and some common understanding about kind of coarse-grained definitions of architecture and design, that makes it easier to have a further conversation about it and start doing more of it. So that's kind of my goal.
Well, that's great. Excellent information, Neal. Thanks for spending some time with us. Make sure and see Neal on the No Fluff Just Stuff tour coming to a city near you. Thanks again, Neal.
Thanks.